Learn English through story. The woman who knew too much. She had always been an observer, the kind of woman who noticed things others missed: the slight tremor in a hand, the hesitation before a lie, the silence that spoke louder than words. Evelyn Mercer never asked for this ability, nor did she ever consider it a gift. It was a burden, one that followed her like a shadow through the crowded streets of New York, through the elegant halls of power, and into the quiet corners of her own mind, where she kept secrets even from herself. Evelyn worked as an archivist for the city's legal division, a job that required discretion and patience. It was a place where records were buried, where history was rewritten in fine print, and where truth was often a matter of interpretation. She had been there long enough to recognize patterns, names that reappeared in lawsuits only to vanish, real estate transactions that made no sense, cases that were suddenly dismissed. She noticed, but she never said a word. That was until she found the file. It was an ordinary folder, unremarkable at first glance. But as soon as her fingers brushed against the paper, she knew it was different. The pages smelled of damp ink, as if they had been rushed into existence. The documents detailed a series of acquisitions by a private corporation that technically didn't exist. The signatories were names she recognized: politicians, CEOs, even a judge, but their signatures were slightly off, just enough to make her stomach tighten. She hesitated. This was beyond her, beyond the quiet world of archives and forgotten records. But the longer she stared, the more it became clear someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever this was. And Evelyn, without meaning to, had become the one person who knew too much. Her first mistake was researching it. A simple search in the city's database should have turned up nothing, but instead it triggered a chain reaction. The next morning, her desk had been searched, her computer reset, her security access revoked. No one said anything outright, but their eyes did. Whispers followed her down the hallway, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of being watched. She told herself to stop, to let it go, but something about the file lingered in her mind, a quiet whisper in the back of her thoughts. And when a man in a grey suit appeared in her usual cafe and ordered the same drink as her without ever looking at the menu, she knew it was too late. Evelyn wasn't the kind of woman who ran, but she was the kind who planned. That night, she packed a small bag, left her apartment through the fire escape, and disappeared into the city she thought she knew. But the more she ran, the more she realized that knowledge was not power, it was a curse. And some secrets, once uncovered, refused to be forgotten. Evelyn moved through the city with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be invisible. She changed subway lines twice, took an unmarked taxi, and switched coats with a woman in a laundromat after paying her $50. By the time she reached a small motel on the outskirts of Queens, she felt as if she had peeled away parts of herself, leaving a trail of false identities behind. But she knew better than to think she was safe. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and forgotten time. She locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. The file was gone. Whatever she had uncovered, someone had made sure to erase her access to it. But she still remembered. And if they had gone to such lengths to track her, then it meant one thing: she had stumbled onto something they couldn't afford to let her reveal. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small notebook, where she had written down the details before leaving her office. A name stood out: Orion Holdings. It wasn't a company she recognized, but it had been listed as a silent partner in multiple city projects, all of which seemed to be tied to land acquisitions near the waterfront. That was where she would start. Evelyn didn't have friends she could trust, not in a situation like this. But there was one person who owed her journalist named Michael Greer. Years ago, she had slipped him an anonymous tip about a housing scam that had led to a major corruption scandal. He never found out it was her, but she had followed his career ever since, watching him dig into the kind of truths that made enemies. If anyone could help her, it was him. She used a burner phone to send a single message: meet me at the diner on 14th, midnight. Then she waited. Time crawled. Every sound from the hallway made her breath hitch. The paranoia was sinking in, the weight of knowing too much pressing against her ribs. But when the clock struck 11, she forced herself up, slipped out the back entrance, and disappeared into the night once more. The diner was nearly empty when she arrived. Greer sat in a booth near the window, his leather jacket worn from years of use, his sharp eyes scanning the street like a man who had learned to expect trouble. Evelyn slid into the seat across from him without a word. "You don't look so good," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "And I don't get mystery messages at midnight from people who are doing just fine." She exhaled slowly. "I need your help." He raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" She hesitated, then slid the notebook across the table. He opened it, flipping through the pages, his expression tightening with each line. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is that someone wants this buried. And I think people have died to keep it that way." Greer let out a low whistle. "Evelyn, do you have any idea who you're messing with?" She met his gaze. "Not yet, but I'm about to find out." Greer stared at the notebook for a long moment, then closed it with a quiet snap. He leaned back in the booth, drumming his fingers against the table. "You're in deep," he muttered. "Deeper than you realize." Evelyn studied him. "You recognize something." "I recognize everything," he said grimly. "Orion Holdings isn't just another shell company. It's a front for something bigger. Every time I've tried to pull at the threads, they've disappeared. Documents vanish. Sources go quiet. And now you show up with their name in a file you weren't supposed to see." He exhaled sharply. "That means you're a problem." The words settled between them like a weight. Evelyn wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, trying to steady herself. "What do they want?" Greer shook his head. "Control, power, and if they think you're a threat, they won't just erase your file. They'll erase you." A cold realization crept over her. She had always known, in the abstract, that the world operated on hidden rules, that power wasn't just about money, but about who controlled the information. But now, she was no longer just an observer. She was inside the machine, and it was closing around her. She straightened. "Then we expose them." Greer let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's not that simple. You don't just expose people like this. They don't allow it." Evelyn reached for the notebook, flipping to the last page where she had scribbled a list of names. "These are the key players. If we find out what connects them, we have leverage." He studied her, then exhaled. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" She shook her head. Greer sighed. "Then we need to be smart about this. No phone calls, no emails. If you've been tracked, they'll already be watching your digital footprint. From now on, we communicate in person only." Evelyn nodded. She could feel the shift, the moment where she crossed from accidental witness to active participant. There was no turning back now. Greer pulled a napkin from the dispenser and scribbled an address. "Meet me here tomorrow. It's safe. For now." She took it, memorizing the address before tucking it into her sleeve. "What are you going to do?" He smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Dig." She left first, slipping out the side door and blending into the night. Her pulse was steady, but her mind was racing. She had always been careful, always stayed in the background, but knowledge was a dangerous thing. And now she knew too much. As she walked down the darkened streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The city, once familiar, now felt like a maze of unseen eyes and whispered threats. And somewhere in the shadows, she knew they were waiting. Evelyn walked with purpose, but her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The weight of knowing too much had already begun to reshape her reality-erased files. Whispered threats, and the undeniable feeling that she was no longer just a spectator in the game of power. She was a target. She took a different route back to her motel, doubling back twice to see if she was being followed. Every reflection in a storefront window made her pulse quicken. Was that man in the grey coat the same one she'd seen near the subway? Had the woman at the bodega hesitated a little too long before handing her change? Paranoia and reality blurred into a single, suffocating sensation. Inside her room, she locked the door, placed a chair under the handle, and sat at the edge of the bed. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, she spread out the few scraps of evidence she had left her notes. The address Greer had given her, and the single, undeniable fact that Orion Holdings wasn't just a business entity. It was a machine, and she had stumbled into its gears. She thought about Greer's warning. They don't allow exposure. But what if there was a way to turn their methods against them? Information was their greatest weapon. Maybe it could be hers too. By dawn, she had a plan. She left the motel just as the city was beginning to stir, blending into the commuters heading for their morning routines. The address Greer had given her led to an old printing shop in Brooklyn, the kind of place that had once been busy before everything went digital. Now, it was a front. She recognized it immediately. No customers, no real business, just a cover for something else. Inside, Greer was already waiting. "Did you sleep?" he asked, looking her over. "Did you?" she countered. He smirked. "Fair enough. Come on." He led her through the shop to a back room filled with old newspapers, filing cabinets, and a few outdated computers. "This place used to be a real operation," he said. "Before print started dying. Now, it's off the grid. No cameras, no records. Safe enough for now." Evelyn sat across from him, laying out her notebook. "I've been thinking. Orion Holdings operates in the shadows, right? They erase records, manipulate information. That means their biggest strength is also their biggest vulnerability." Greer raised an eyebrow. "Go on. What if we make them visible? If they rely on secrecy, then we take that away. We create a story too big to erase." Greer leaned back, considering. "It's a bold move. Dangerous as hell. But if we pull it off..." He tapped a pen against the desk. "We'd need to make it big, not just a single leak. We'd need evidence, multiple sources, and we'd need to release it in a way they can't contain." Evelyn's mind was already racing ahead. "We'll need more than just my notes. We need names, document something solid." Green nodded. "And I think I know where to start." He pulled out a file from one of the cabinets, tossing it onto the table. Evelyn opened it and felt her stomach drop. It was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. A man shaking hands with a politician at a private gala. But the man wasn't just anyone. He was one of the names from the file she'd found. "They've been hiding in plain sight," Greer said. "We just have to connect the dots." Evelyn exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The point of no return. And somewhere, in the depths of the city's power structures, she knew someone was already watching, waiting, and deciding what to do about the woman who knew too much. Evelyn traced the edge of the photograph with her fingertips, her mind racing. The man in the image, Richard Calloway, was more than just an name on a file. He was a powerful developer, a billionaire whose influence stretched beyond real estate and into politics, media, and the courts. If he was connected to Orion Holdings, it meant the conspiracy was even larger than she'd imagined. Greer leaned forward. "Calloway's clean on paper. No scandals, no controversies. But if he's tied to Orion, it means he's orchestrating something from behind the scenes." He tapped the photograph. "The question is, what's his endgame?" Evelyn exhaled, pushing aside the weight of fear. "We find out, and we make sure the world knows before they can bury it." Greer studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we need to be smart. If we come at this the wrong way, we disappear." Evelyn's grip tightened around the notebook. She knew what he meant. People didn't just lose their jobs over secrets like this. They lost their lives. They spent the next few hours digging, cross-referencing Calloway's known business, dealings with the hidden network of Orion Holdings. The connections were subtle but undeniable: shell companies, purchasing land through third parties, court cases that vanished before trial, political donations that conveniently aligned with key policy changes. "This isn't just corruption," Evelyn murmured, scanning the records. "It's a blueprint for control." Greer frowned. "Meaning?" "Look at the locations they're acquiring: waterfronts, transit hubs, entire neighborhoods. They're not just buying property. They're buying the city itself." Greer swore under his breath. "They're positioning themselves to dictate the future: who lives where, who benefits, who gets left behind." He looked at her. "This isn't just about money. This is power on a scale most people don't even realize exists." Evelyn felt the weight of it settle over her. The kind of knowledge that changed everything. The kind that got people killed. She inhaled deeply. "We need more than just this. We need a source inside." Greer nodded slowly. "I might know someone, but it's risky." Evelyn met his gaze. "Everything about this is risky. But we don't stop now." Greer pulled out his phone, removed the battery, and slid a slip of paper across the table. "Be at this address in 2 hours, alone." Evelyn took the paper, memorized the location, and burned it in an old coffee can. She didn't ask who they were meeting. She didn't need to. She was already too deep to turn back. 2 hours later, Evelyn arrived at a rundown bar on the edge of the city. The kind of place where forgotten men drown their regrets in cheap whiskey. She stepped inside, scanning the room. Greer was already there, sitting with a man whose face was hidden beneath a worn baseball cap. As she approached, the man lifted his head just enough for her to see. His eyes, sharp, tired, haunted. "This her?" he asked. Greer nodded. "Evelyn, meet Daniel Shaw, former city planner, and the guy who nearly got himself killed for asking too many questions." Shaw smirked a bit early. "And yet, here I am. Guess I didn't ask enough." Evelyn sat across from him. "You worked on one of Calloway's projects." Shaw's jaw tightened. "I was the one who tried to stop it." He slid a flash drive across the table. "Blueprints, memos, internal reports. Calloway's been manipulating zoning laws for years, bribing officials, silencing opposition. Orion Holdings isn't just a front, it's the framework for something bigger." He looked at her. "You really want to know what they're building?" Evelyn hesitated, then took the drive. Shaw's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're not just buying the city. They're rewriting its future. And once they're done, no one will even remember the way it was before." Evelyn felt a chill run through her. Some knowledge was dangerous. Some secrets could destroy lives. But now there was no escaping the truth. She was the woman who knew too much. Evelyn gripped the flash drive tightly, its small weight feeling immense in her palm. This was more than just proof. It was the blueprint of a city being, rewritten under the control of a hidden force. Calloway and Orion Holdings weren't just corrupt businessmen. They were architects of a future shaped by secrecy, where the powerful dictated reality itself. Shaw leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "I tried to bring this to the city council. I tried to warn them. A week later, I was hit with bogus fraud charges. My accounts were frozen, and my wife started receiving threats. I barely got out before they could silence me for good." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Why didn't you go public?" Shaw laughed a bit early. "You think a story like this makes it to the public? The media is owned. The police are compromised. The courts, useless. Every time someone gets close, they get crushed." He eyed her. "Which means you need to be careful. They already know who you are." Greer exhaled sharply. "Then we don't have time to play it safe." Evelyn met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. If they hesitated, they would lose. If they tried to play by the rules, they would disappear. She turned back to Shaw. "You said Calloway's rewriting the city. What exactly is he planning?" Shaw hesitated, then pulled out a napkin and sketched a rough map of the city's waterfront. "See these areas? They've been rezoned in the past 5 years. Officially, it's for urban renewal, new housing, new businesses, all the usual excuses. But look closer, these projects aren't for the people. They're consolidation points." Evelyn frowned. "Consolidation for what?" Shaw's expression darkened. "Control. They're shaping entire districts to serve a very specific elite. Everyone else? Pushed out, priced out, and eventually erased." He pointed to a section of the waterfront. This was supposed to be low-income housing. Instead, they stalled construction until the area was declared unsafe. Now, it's being sold off in pieces to Orion subsidiaries. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "So they create problems, then offer the solution on their terms." Shaw nodded. "And anyone who resists? Well, accidents happen." A heavy silence settled over the table. Evelyn clenched her fists. This wasn't just corruption, it was a calculated erasure of entire communities, disguised as progress. Greer exhaled. "All right, we have evidence. We have names. Now we need to move before they know we have it." Evelyn nodded. "We need a way to release this so they can't bury it." Shaw shook his head. "It's not that simple. They don't just suppress information. They rewrite it. If you go to the press, they'll spin it. If you go online, they'll flood the web with counter-narratives." Evelyn's mind raced. "Then we give it to someone they can't control." Greer frowned. "Who?" She thought for a long moment, then her eyes widened. "What if we bypass the system entirely? What if we make this too big for them to contain?" Shaw gave her a wary look. "You're talking about a mass leak. You'd be making yourself a target." Evelyn swallowed hard. "I already am." Greer nodded slowly. "Then we need to go big. We don't just drop this in one place, we flood every outlet, every independent journalist, every international news source. We make it global before they can react." Shaw hesitated, then finally slid another slip of paper across the table. I have one last contact. He's been off the grid for years. But if anyone can help you distribute this without interference, it's him. Evelyn picked it up. Just an address, no name. Greer exhaled. Looks like we're going all in. Evelyn's jaw tightened. We have no choice. They left the bar separately, each taking different routes to shake any possible tails. Evelyn's pulse was steady, but she could feel the weight of the decision settling over her. She was no longer just a woman who knew too much. She was a woman who had one chance to make sure the truth survived, and she was ready to risk everything. Evelyn walked through the damp streets, her mind racing with the weight of what lay ahead. The city felt different now. Every shadow stretched longer, every face in the crowd a potential threat. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The slip of paper Shaw had given her was already burning a hole in her pocket. She needed to find this contact, but she also needed to be sure she wasn't being followed. She stopped at a corner store, pretending to browse the shelves, while using the reflection in the glass to scan the street behind her. Nothing. But that didn't mean she was alone. She grabbed a pack of gum, paid in cash, and took a long, winding route toward the address Shaw had given her. Every few blocks, she switched direction, stepped into shops, or doubled back on her path. By the time she reached the location, a small, run-down bookstore wedged between two boarded-up buildings, her heart was hammering in her chest. She pushed the door open, a bell jingling overhead. The place smelled like dust and old paper. A man sat behind the counter, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He didn't look up. "You, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. She hesitated. "Who's asking?" The man smirked, flipping a page in the book he was reading. "If you don't know who I am, then you're either very brave or very stupid." He finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "But Shaw sent you, so I'm guessing you're the first one." Evelyn exhaled. "Then you know why I'm here." He nodded. "You have something dangerous, and you need it out there before they can shut you down." She pulled the flash drive from her pocket and slid it across the counter. "This is everything. Names, documents, blueprints. If we can get it to the right people." The man held up a hand. "Slow down." He picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. "You think this is enough?" Evelyn frowned. "It's proof." He sighed. "It's a start. But proof isn't enough when you're dealing with people like Callaway and Orion Holdings. They control the story. Even with this, they'll flood the media with counter-claims. Call you a liar, discredit everything before the truth can take hold. Greer had warned her about this. Still, hearing it from someone who had clearly been in the trenches before made it feel even more real. "So, what do we do?" she asked. The man leaned forward. "We make it undeniable." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "How?" He smirked. "We don't just expose Orion, we make them implode." The plan? The bookstore became their war room. Greer joined them an hour later, and together they mapped out their attack. The goal wasn't just to leak the files. It was to trigger a chain reaction, so fast and so public that Orion Holdings couldn't contain the fallout. Step 1. Create a digital dead man switch. If anything happened to Evelyn, the files would be released to hundreds of journalists, watchdog organizations, and public forums. She would be too dangerous to kill unless they wanted the story to go nuclear. Step 2. Leak the right pieces to the right people. Instead of dumping everything at once, they would strategically release information to reporters, activists, and rival corporations, anyone with a reason to turn against Callaway and Orion. Step 3. Draw them out. Orion worked best in the shadows. If they could force Callaway into the open, make him respond publicly, he'd be vulnerable in ways he wasn't used to. Step 4. Expose the enforcers. The people who erased evidence, threatened whistleblowers, and made people disappear. They were Orion's biggest weapon. If Evelyn and Greer could unmask them, fear would shift. People inside the organization might start turning on each other. Step 5. Survive long enough to see it through. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keyboard in the bookstore's back room, her breath steady despite the storm raging inside her. The first email went to a trusted journalist Greer had worked with before, someone too stubborn to be bought, too paranoid to be silenced. Within minutes, the journalist responded, "If this is real, it's the biggest story in the last decade. But I need more." Evelyn sent the first batch of documents. The zoning fraud, the manipulated housing policies, The proof of shell companies. 20 minutes later, a second email came through. This is real, I'm in. But be careful. They're already looking for you. Her pulse spiked. Time to move, the bookstore owner said, already packing a bag. This place won't be safe once they figure out where the leak started. Evelyn shoved the laptop into her bag and followed him out the back door. Greer was already on the phone, arranging a safe house. They moved fast, disappearing into the city like ghosts. And as they slipped away, the first news article about Orion Holdings hit the web. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. News anchors discussed the leaks in hushed, urgent tones. Online forums exploded with theories. Even mainstream media, usually controlled by corporate interests, couldn't ignore the evidence. Then, the real battle began. Orion Holdings fired back with denials. Callaway issued a carefully crafted statement, calling the accusations baseless and an attack on progress. Paid commentators flooded social media, calling Evelyn a fraud, an attention seeker, a criminal. But Evelyn was ready. She released more files, more evidence. Then, she dropped the bombshell, the list of enforcers. Names, photos, surveillance footage. The people who had threatened journalists, bribed officials, and silenced whistleblowers. Their faces were suddenly everywhere, and the fear shifted. For the first time, Orion's enforcers were the ones being hunted. Reporters started digging into their pasts. Some of them disappeared overnight, running before they could be questioned. Others turned on Orion, feeding more information to the press in a desperate bid to save themselves. Then came the real turning point. An anonymous source, likely someone deep inside, Orion released an internal email thread between Callaway and several high-ranking officials. It was undeniable proof of intent, not just corruption, but deliberate social engineering. Plans to displace communities, plans to manipulate elections, plans to erase opposition. Evelyn watched the news from a safe house, her hands trembling as she listened to the latest reports. In light of these revelations, federal investigators have launched a probe into Orion Holdings and its executives. Sources say Richard Callaway has gone into hiding as arrest warrants are being considered. This may be the biggest corporate scandal in modern history. Evelyn exhaled. They had done it, but it wasn't over, because knowing too much had made her a target before. And now, exposing the truth had made her something even more dangerous. A woman they could never let walk away. Evelyn sat in the dimly lit safe house, her pulse still hammering in her ears as she watched the fallout unfold. The news cycle was relentless. More leaks were dropping every hour. Investigative journalists were tearing apart Orion Holdings, exposing layers of corruption that stretched further than even she had imagined. But beneath the surface, she knew a storm was brewing. Greer paced by the window, his jaw tied as he peeked through the blinds. They won't just let this go, Evelyn. Callaway might be on the run, but Orion isn't just one man. They'll regroup, and they'll come for you. Evelyn exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She knew Greer was right. The truth had gone public, but now, survival was the real battle. Orion Holdings wasn't just a company, it was a machine. And she had thrown a wrench into its gears. That meant people in high places were making desperate phone calls. Money was changing hands, and decisions were being made in darkened rooms. Decisions about her. The bookstore owner who had finally introduced himself as Jameson sat at the table, going through encrypted messages on his laptop. We're already seeing signs of counterattacks. Callaway's allies are scrambling, trying to spin this as a coordinated disinformation campaign. They're throwing everything they have at this. Evelyn clenched her fists. They're trying to turn me into the villain. Greer nodded. And they're damn good at it. They'll pull every trick in the book: fake financial crimes, fabricated past scandals, even tying you to foreign enemies if they can. They'll make you look like a lie before they make you disappear. Jameson's eyes flicked to the screen. Too late. They're already moving. He turned the laptop around, showing them a live news broadcast. Breaking news. Investigative journalist linked to domestic terrorism. Evelyn's stomach dropped. The anchor continued. Evidence has surfaced suggesting Evelyn Graves, the journalist behind the controversial Orion Holdings leaks, has ties to known radical organizations. Documents obtained from anonymous sources suggest she may have been working with extremist groups to undermine government stability. Evelyn's vision blurred as rage bubbled inside her. This is a lie. A blatant lie. Greer grabbed his phone. Of course it is. But if they repeat it enough times, people will start believing it. Jameson tapped furiously on his keyboard. They're fabricating everything in real time. They have teams working around the clock to discredit you. This isn't just damage control, it's character assassination. He turned the screen back to himself, muttering, "All right, you sons of bitches. Let's see how well you cover your tracks." Evelyn sat back, forcing herself to breathe. "We need to stay ahead of them." Jameson smirked. "Already on it. I'm tracing where these fake documents came from. If we can prove they're fabrications before they gain traction, we can flip the script." Greer looked up. "And we need to move? The safe house won't be safe for long." Evelyn nodded, forcing herself into action. She grabbed her bag, stuffing in the essentials. If Orion thought they could erase her with lies, she would show them just how wrong they were. The fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The hunters become the hunted. The next 48 hours were a blur. Evelyn, Greer, and Jameson moved between safe locations, dodging surveillance and staying ahead of Orion's operatives. Meanwhile, the battle online was raging. Jameson, a cyber warfare expert who had spent years fighting against corporate disinformation, worked tirelessly to dismantle Orion's smear campaign. He traced the fake documents back to a shell company owned by an Orion subsidiary. The moment they had that proof, Evelyn went on the offensive. She uploaded the evidence in real time, exposing Orion's attempt to frame her before their false narrative could fully take hold. Every major journalist, activist, and watchdog organization got the files. And it worked. Within hours, the tide began to turn. The smear campaign crumbled under scrutiny. Media outlets that had once parroted Orion's lies were now questioning the origins of the false allegations. The truth was back on Evelyn's side. But Orion wasn't done. Because the moment they lost control of the story, they turned to their last, most brutal option: violence. The shadow war begins. It started with a missing person. One of the journalists who had reported on Orion's crimes vanished. No sign of a struggle, no calls, just a gone. Then came the accidents. A political analyst who had spoken out against Orion died in a car crash. Brake failure. An activist who had helped spread Evelyn's leaks was found in a motel room. Suicide, they claimed. Evelyn felt the noose tightening. She knew what this was. Orion was sending a message. They were cleaning up loose ends. And she was next. Greer loaded his gun, checking the chamber. "We need to disappear, Evelyn. Now." Evelyn shook her head. "No, we push harder. We make it so public that they can't touch us." Jameson looked up. "You're talking about going fully public? On camera?" Evelyn met his gaze. "I'm talking about burning them down completely." 2 days later, Evelyn went live. Not through mainstream media. Not through a journalist. She spoke directly to the world. A secured video feed, broadcast across social media, encrypted to prevent takedown. Within minutes, tens of millions were watching. She laid it all out. The corruption, the manipulation, the smear campaign, the deaths. Then, she said the words that changed everything. "If anything happens to me, to my team, or to anyone involved in exposing Orion Holdings, I have one final release one that will bury them completely. And it will go live automatically." It was a bluff. But Orion didn't know that. The moment she said it, the game changed. Orion couldn't risk killing her. Not without knowing what else she had. They had lost control. And the world was watching. The aftermath. Over the next month, arrests were made. Calloway was taken into custody. But Evelyn knew he was just a face. Orion Holdings shattered into fragments. Some trying to survive, others turning against each other. The machine had been broken. But Evelyn also knew this wasn't an ending. It was a warning. Because power never truly disappears, it just finds new hands. And somewhere, in another darkened room, new deals were being made. New secrets were forming. New truths that someone, someday, would have to uncover. But for now, Evelyn had survived. And the woman who knew too much had become something even more powerful. The woman they could never silence. The days after Evelyn's broadcast passed in a haze. The world devoured the truth. But the machine she had cracked continued to grind forward. Slower now, but still alive. The headlines shifted from outrage to investigation. And then inevitably to distraction. New scandals, new crises. The city's attention flickered away. But Evelyn knew the deeper forces never stopped moving. Orion Holdings was dismantled in the public eye, but behind closed doors, the survivors scattered into smaller companies, dissolving under false names, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Calloway's arrest was a headline, but he wasn't the mastermind, he was a puppet. The true architects remained hidden, their names buried beneath layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts. Evelyn's face was everywhere now. For weeks, reporters camped outside courthouses, chasing her for interviews. Some praised her courage. Others painted her as reckless, a woman who had endangered national security in the name of self-righteous truth. The smear campaigns never fully stopped, but they had lost their sharp edge. The world was watching too closely now, yet none of it felt like victory. She stayed in the shadows, moving between safe houses, never staying in one place long enough to be traced. Jameson kept their network secure, but even he couldn't erase the constant feeling of being watched. Greer remained close, always armed, always scanning every room they entered. The weight of survival hung between them, heavier than any victory. "You should leave the city," Greer said one night, his voice low as they sat in a cramped apartment above a hardware store. Evelyn stared out the window at the rain-slicked streets below. "And go where?" "Anywhere. South America. Eastern Europe. Disappear." She shook her head slowly. "If I disappear, they win." Greer leaned forward, his tired eyes hard. "They've already lost. The story's out. Calloway's in prison. You've done enough." Evelyn's gaze stayed fixed on the streetlights flickering in the distance. "They'll rebuild. Maybe not today. Maybe not next year. But they'll come back. Someone always does." Greer's silence was answer enough. They both knew the truth exposing corruption didn't kill it. It only forced it to evolve. The weeks stretched into months. Investigations dragged on. Arrests trickled in. But most of the real power players vanished before subpoenas could touch them. Lawyers stalled. Evidence disappeared. The wheels of justice turned slowly. And Evelyn watched as the system she had cracked began to patch itself back together. She worked quietly from the shadows, feeding information to journalists under encrypted aliases. Every leak, every document she released was another small cut against the machine, but she knew it wasn't enough. Her dead man's switch remained in place, a looming threat that kept Orion's remnants at bay. But the weight of living under constant threat began to hollow her out. She barely slept. Her meals were whatever she could grab on the run. Paranoia became a companion, whispering in the back of her mind. Greer stayed by her side, but even he was unraveling. His hands trembled when he thought she wasn't looking. His voice was quieter, his eyes darker. The scars of too many battles etched deep into his face. One night, as they packed up yet another safe house, he finally cracked. "This isn't living, Evelyn." She paused, folding clothes into a worn duffel bag. "It's surviving." Greer's voice broke. "Surviving for what? What's the endgame here? You can't fight forever." Evelyn met his eyes, the shadows beneath them deeper than ever. "I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting so they don't forget." Greer exhaled sharply, running a hand through his greying hair. He didn't argue. He knew there was no convincing her. The world moved on. But Evelyn built something in the silence, a network of watchers, whistleblowers, and ghost journalists. They communicated through encrypted channels, passing information hand to hand, voice to voice. Jameson became the architect, setting up servers in hidden places, creating backdoors into corporate databases and government archives. The network had no name, no official leaders, just 1,000 quiet voices chipping away at the machine from within. They exposed smaller conspiracies, local corruption, environmental cover-ups, human trafficking rings. Nothing as big as Orion. But each small victory carried a greater message. Someone was watching. Evelyn became a myth among them. The woman who knew too much, the ghost in the wires. Her name was whispered in hacker forums and underground journalist circles. Some believed she had vanished. Others swore she was still out there, watching from the shadows. But the truth was far simpler. She was still running, still afraid, still fighting. A year passed, then two. Evelyn lived like a ghost, moving between countries, leaving no trace. Her hair was shorter now, dyed darker. Her eyes harder. Greer had finally walked away, choosing a quieter life far from the shadows. Jameson disappeared into the digital underworld. leaving only encrypted messages behind. She was alone, but the machine was still out there. One rainy night in Berlin, Evelyn received a message on her encrypted channel. "We need to meet." The sender was anonymous, but she recognized the code buried in the signature. It was from someone inside Oriana Defector. She almost ignored it. She almost let the world move on without her. But she couldn't. They met in a small cafe at dawn, the city still half asleep. The man who sat across from her was young, nervous, another cog in the machine who had seen too much. He handed her a single flash drive, his hand shaking. "They're rebuilding," he whispered. "New names, new companies, same people." Evelyn's heart sank. She had always known it would happen. She took the flash drive without a word. "What will you do with it?" the man asked. Evelyn stared at the small device in her palm, feeling its weight. "Burn them down again." The woman they couldn't kill. The world would never know Evelyn Mercer's name. She would never be celebrated, never be safe. But in the shadows, she became something more than a whistleblower or a journalist. She became a guardian, one woman holding back the tide of corruption, one secret at a time. And as long as she lived, the machine would never sleep easy. Because the woman who knew too much was still out there, watching, waiting, fighting. Evelyn sat in a dimly lit apartment, staring at the small flash drive in her palm. It felt heavier than it should, like a stone pressing into her skin, its weight carrying the burden of knowing. The young man who had handed it to her had vanished into the morning fog, blending back into the world of nameless faces. But his warning echoed in her ears. "They're rebuilding. New names, new companies, same people." Orion Holdings was supposed to be dead. She had torn them apart, exposed their corruption, dragged their crimes into the light. But she had known, deep down, that this was never a permanent victory. Power didn't disappear. It just moved, reshaped itself, evolved. Evelyn closed her fingers around the flash drive. "What will you do with it?" The man had asked her that, his voice tinged with fear. She already knew the answer. She plugged the drive into her encrypted laptop and watched as the files unfolded before her. Documents, financial records, private communications, names she recognized, others she didn't. Orion had scattered like embers, but here they were, rekindling into flame. And she was the only one who knew. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. How many times could she fight this battle? How many times could she pull the same trigger and expect the machine to stay down? Her body ached from years of running. Her mind felt frayed, stretched too thin by the weight of paranoia. The faces of the lost haunted her, the journalists who had vanished, the activists silenced, the allies who had given everything to bring the truth to light. Evelyn had won before, but victory had been a moment, a flicker. Now, the war was starting again. Could she do it? Would she survive at this time? She exhaled slowly. Survival isn't the point. The truth is. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving without hesitation. One last fight. The moment Evelyn began her next move, she felt the pressure shift. She released a single piece of information, a financial transaction linking one of Orion's rebranded firms to a senator's offshore account. It was a small cut, barely enough to draw blood, but it sent a message: someone is watching. The reaction was immediate. First, a smear article appeared, accusing her of being a rogue journalist with an agenda. Then, her encrypted accounts came under attack, hackers trying to trace her location, dismantle her networks. Jameson, working from the depths of the digital underworld, fended them off, leaving cryptic messages in their code. But Evelyn knew this was just the beginning. The machine was waking up. Days later, she noticed the shadows at the edges of her vision. A man reading a newspaper but never turning the page. A car parked too long outside her building. Footsteps that matched hers one block too far. They were hunting her again. She had been here before, but this time, something felt different. This time, they weren't just trying to discredit her. They were trying to erase her. Evelyn moved cities, then countries, Paris, Madrid, Istanbul. She left no digital trail. But it didn't matter. They always found her. In a safe house in Athens, she finally called Greer. "I need your help," she said. A long pause. Then, his wary voice, "I was hoping you'd never say that." He came anyway. When he arrived, she barely recognized him. His hair was whiter, his face more lined, but his presence was the same, solid, unshaken. They sat in silence for a long time. Then, Greer spoke. What's the endgame here, Evelyn? There is no endgame. He shook his head. Then why fight? She looked at him, her voice quiet but certain. Because someone has to. Greer exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. This will be the last time. You know that, right? They won't let you get away again. Evelyn nodded. She knew. So they planned. One last release. One final strike. The files weren't just about Orion this time. They exposed everything: politicians, corporations, intelligence agencies, the entire ecosystem of power that allowed Orion to exist in the first place. This wasn't just a revelation. It was a reckoning. Evelyn prepared the dead man's switch. If anything happened to her, the files would go live across hundreds of channels, impossible to erase. Greer checked his weapons, watching her carefully. You sure about this? Evelyn met his gaze. I was sure the first time. I'll be sure until the last. The night before she was set to release the files, Evelyn stepped onto a rooftop in Athens, staring out at the city. She thought of everyone who had fought beside her, those who had vanished, those who had died. She had survived longer than she expected, longer than she had any right to. But the machine never stopped, and neither could she. The next morning, she pressed the button. The files spread like wildfire. Newsrooms scrambled. Governments panicked. The internet flooded with names, transactions, recordings, proof of decades of corruption, all in the hands of the people now. There was no stopping it, and Evelyn knew what would come next. She left before they could find her, vanishing into the chaos she had unleashed. She was a fugitive now, more than ever before. But she was something else too. A ghost, a legend, a force they could never truly silence. Because as long as there were secrets to uncover, as long as there was corruption hiding in the dark, the woman who knew too much would never be forgotten. Years passed. The world changed. The name shifted, but the power structures remained. But every so often, in the darkest corners of the internet, an aim would appear. A mercer. A file would leak. A truth would surface. A scandal would break. No one could ever prove where it came from. But those who remembered knew. She was still out there, watching, waiting, and the machine would never sleep easy again. Evelyn Mercer vanished after the files went public. Governments scrambled to contain the fallout. Some denied the evidence outright. Others launched investigations, sacrificing a few names to appease the public while ensuring the machine itself remained intact. It was the same cycle she had seen before. But this time, something was different. The world didn't just forget. Protests erupted across cities. Whistleblowers emerged from the shadows, emboldened by the storm Evelyn had unleashed. Anonymous leaks flooded the internet, each one a new crack in the foundation of power. The machine was bleeding, but Evelyn knew it would never truly die. That was why she had to disappear. Governments labelled her a traitor. Corporations called her a terrorist. The media debated her legacy. Was she a hero or a criminal? A martyr or a fugitive? Behind closed doors, the truth was simpler. They wanted her dead. Every intelligence agency in the world had her face on a watch list. Every border was a trap. Every electronic device a vulnerability. Evelyn had prepared for this. She abandoned all technology, severing ties with even her most trusted allies. She changed her appearance, crossing borders with false identities, moving from city to city like a shadow. No digital footprints. No messages, no traces. To the world, she was gone. But in the quiet corners of resistance, her name remained a whisper. And every so often, when the machine least expected it, a new truth would surface. A leak exposing a secret meeting. A document revealing an illicit deal. A recording proving a conspiracy. The world would ask, who was behind it? The answer was always the same. The woman who knew too much. Years passed. Evelyn had no home, no place to belong. She lived in safe houses, in remote villages, in places where no one asked questions. She learned new languages, adapted to new cultures, blended into crowds. But she never stopped watching. She followed the shifting tides of power, waiting for the right moments to strike. Each time the machine grew complacent, she reminded it that she was still out there, a ghost in the system, a shadow in the dark. She never used the same name twice. She never stayed in one place too long, but wherever she went, she listened. Because one day, she knew, she would have to fight again. Evelyn was careful, But in a world where power stretched into every corner, caution was never enough. She was in Buenos Aires when it happened. A face from her past. A name she had erased. A voice she had once trusted. Jameson. The hacker who had once been her ally. The architect of her network. She hadn't spoken to him in years. She hadn't dared to. But somehow, he had found her. And when she saw him, standing in a crowded cafe, she knew. It was over. They met in a quiet park after dark. The city hummed around them, unaware of the moment unfolding in its midst. Jameson's face was thinner. His eyes more hollow. "I didn't want to do this," he said. Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "But you did it anyway." Jameson exhaled. "They gave me a choice. Give you up, or disappear forever." Evelyn studied him. She could hear the regret in his voice, but regret meant nothing now. She had always known this would happen. She had trusted him once. And in her world, trust was always a mistake. "Is it them?" she asked quietly. Jameson hesitated. Then he nodded. Not just any government. All of them. They had set aside their rivalries, their differences. Because Evelyn Mercer was bigger than politics. She was a threat to all of them. And they had finally found her. The streets were too quiet. The city felt too still. She had seen this before. The calm before the storm. Jameson gave her one last look. "Run," he whispered. Then the world exploded. Black SUVs screeched into the streets. Doors slammed open. Footsteps pounded pavement. Evelyn turned and ran. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted through alleyways, leapt over fences, disappeared into the maze of the city. But this time, it wasn't enough. A gunshot. A flash of pain. She stumbled, fell. The world blurred around her. Footsteps closed in. Voices shouted. Then, the woman who wouldn't break. She woke up in a white room. No windows, no clocks. No way to tell where she was. Her wrists were bound. Her body ached. She had been here before. But this time, she wasn't getting out. A man entered, suit, cold eyes. The kind of man who didn't exist on paper. He sat across from her, folding his hands. "Evelyn Mercer," he said calmly. "You've been running for a long time." She stared at him, silent. "We have two options," he continued. "You tell us everything. Every name, every method, every secret." Evelyn didn't move. "And if I don't?" The man smiled faintly. "Then you disappear, completely. No leaks, no whispers, no legend." She met his gaze. "You can't kill an idea." The man leaned forward. "We can bury it." Evelyn knew how this ended. There were no trials for people like her. No last words. Just silence. But she also knew something they didn't. They could kill her, but they would never erase her. Because the truth was already out there. The files, the networks, the people she had inspired. She was just one person. But she had built something bigger than herself. And even if they took her, the war would go on. She smiled. "Do what you want," she said. "They already know." No one knew what happened to Evelyn Mercer after that day. Some said she was executed in a black site. Her body buried where no one would ever find it. Others believed she escaped, slipping back into the shadows, waiting for her next moment to strike. But the truth was written in the world she left behind. Leaks still appeared. Exposures still surfaced. The machine still bled. And every time it did, the same name echoed in whispers. The woman who knew too much. She had become more than a journalist, more than a fugitive. She had become a symbol. And symbols never died. They only grew stronger. Even in the dark. Even in the silence. Even in the places where no one dared to look. Because as long as there were secrets, as long as there was corruption, she would always be watching, waiting. And when the moment came, the woman who knew too much and couldn't be silenced. Evelyn Mercer had disappeared before, but this time it was different. There was no digital trace, no final leak, no whispered clue about where she had gone. The world speculated endlessly, had she been executed, locked away in some hidden prison? Or had she, against all odds, managed to escape once again? Governments issued their denials. Conspiracy forums exploded with theories. Journalists searched for her name in every dark corner of the internet. But there was nothing. It was as if she had never existed. And yet, the world still felt her presence. Because the leaks did not stop. Her legacy refused to die. Months after Evelyn vanished, a new wave of files surfaced. Not just scattered documents this time. A full manifesto, written in Evelyn's unmistakable style. It exposed not only Orion's rebirth, but the hidden architecture of global corruption, the back channels through which power moved, the untraceable accounts, the alliances between governments and corporations. It was more than an expose. It was a blueprint for dismantling the system itself. It spread like wildfire. Everywhere, the machine fought to contain its censorship. Disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks against the websites hosting the files. But it was too late. The truth had already taken root. And somewhere, in the spaces between surveillance cameras and tracking algorithms, a whisper spread. Evelyn Mercer is still alive. The leaks did something no one had expected. They didn't just expose corruption. They mobilized people. Journalists, hackers, whistleblowers, ordinary citizens, people who had once felt powerless now had a guide, a call to action. They formed encrypted networks, organizing in the shadows, sharing information across borders. Some took to the streets. Others worked in secret, infiltrating the very institutions that had once seemed untouchable. Governments cracked down harder, arrests, raids, disappearances. But it only made the movement stronger. They called themselves the Unseen. And in every protest sign, every encrypted message, every act of defiance, one name stood at the center. Evelyn Mercer. The machine would not let this stand. Evelyn had been an enemy before. Now, she was a symbol. And symbols were dangerous. So the hunt began again. Every intelligence agency, every private contractor, every hidden arm of the system turned its gaze toward one goal. Find Evelyn Mercer. Some believed she was still in hiding. Others believed she had orchestrated her own disappearance, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. A few, the most paranoid, feared something worse. That she was no longer one person. That she had become an idea, multiplied and carried by countless others. If that was true, then killing her wouldn't stop anything. But they would try anyway. In a small town in Eastern Europe, an old man named Greer sat in a quiet cafe, reading the news. He had done his best to stay out of it all. But as he scrolled through his screen, he saw something that made his breath catch. A message, hidden in the metadata of a leak file. One only he would recognize. A single phrase. Still watching. Greer set down his coffee, his hand steady despite the storm rising inside him. Evelyn wasn't dead. She was still out there. And she wasn't finished. Not yet. No one ever found Evelyn Mercer. Some say she died years ago, her work carried on by those she inspired. Others swear they've seen her shadow slipping through a border crossing, a face hidden beneath a hood in a crowded station. But the truth doesn't need a face. It doesn't need a name. It only needs to be heard. And as long as there were those who fought in the dark, who refused to look away, who kept pushing against the machine, then Evelyn Mercer would never truly disappear. Because some voices could never be silenced, and some truths would never stay buried. The woman who knew too much was gone, but her war had only just begun. Evelyn Mercer was gone, but her name had become something else, more than a person, more than a journalist, more than even a symbol. She had become a myth. Governments still whispered about her in classified meetings. Intelligence agencies still kept her file open, despite having no leads. Corporations still feared her name appearing in unseen corners of the internet and across the world, in encrypted chat rooms, in hidden forums, in underground networks. Her words were still repeated. The machine is not invincible. Power is not untouchable. The truth is only dangerous when people refuse to see it. Years passed. Governments adapted. The machine evolved. But so did those who had been inspired by Evelyn. The unseen, the movement she had unknowingly created, became something the world had never seen before, an invisible force, operating outside the reach of laws and borders, using the very tools of the machine against it. They infiltrated corporations, leaked classified documents, exposed hidden agendas, and the more they fought, the more it became clear. Evelyn Mercer was not just one woman anymore. She was thousands, tens of thousands. An idea that had taken root, unstoppable, untouchable. Every time the machine crushed one cell, two more emerged. Every time a whistleblower disappeared, another stepped forward. The war Evelyn had started was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone. No one had seen Evelyn in years, but the name still appeared on classified government threat assessments, in the dark corners of the internet. Sometimes, a leaked file would appear, signed with only one letter, E. Sometimes, an anonymous voice would speak in an encrypted chat, warning of a coming scandal, guiding the unseen toward the next target. And sometimes, in a crowded city, someone would swear they had seen her older now. Perhaps her hair streaked with grey, but her eyes still sharp, still watching. Of course, the machine dismissed these claims. Evelyn Mercer was dead. She had to be, because if she wasn't, then that meant she was still out there, still waiting, still fighting, and they would never truly be safe. One day, in the middle of the night, across every major news network, every government server, every encrypted message board, a broadcast appeared. A grainy video. A woman standing in the shadows. Her face was blurred, but her voice was unmistakable. You thought you could bury me. You thought you could erase what I started. But you can't erase the truth. The video was gone in minutes, wiped from every official channel, but it was too late. It had already spread, and in its wake, a final message. Still watching. Government scrambled to contain the panic. Was it really her? Was Evelyn Mercer alive? Or was it someone else, someone carrying on her work? No one knew for sure. But one thing was clear. The war was far from over. And as long as corruption thrived, as long as the machine existed, so would the woman who knew too much. The video had sent a ripple of fear through the highest circles of power. The machine had survived many threats before, but this was different. The world should have forgotten Evelyn Mercer. Instead, she had become a legend. Governments launched full-scale cyber operations, searching for the origin of the broadcast. Intelligence agencies turned their best analysts toward decoding the footage. Every hidden satellite, every secret eye program was aimed at finding the ghost who refused to stay buried. And yet, there was nothing. No trace, no source. It was as if the message had come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For the first time, those in power felt something they had never experienced before. Fear, because they had controlled the world for so long, dictated the rules, manipulated the truth. But now, they had no control over the one thing that could destroy them. Evelyn Mercer's truth. The unseen had grown beyond a mere resistance. They were an underground network, a decentralized force that governments could not track, arrest, or silence. They didn't just leak information anymore. They fought back. One by one, the pillars of the machine trembled. High-profile politicians exposed for secret dealings. Entire banking systems compromised, revealing illicit transfers of wealth. Corporations brought to their knees as hidden. Documents unveiled decades of corruption. The world was no longer a place where lies went unchallenged. And at the heart of it all, a single question. Where is Evelyn Mercer? The search for Evelyn became an obsession. Governments set aside their rivalries, forming a secret task force known only as Obsidian, an alliance of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies, pooling resources to do the impossible. Find Evelyn, erase her legacy, destroy the movement she had created. For years, they searched. They found a whisper's old safe houses, contacts who swore she had been there only days before, but never Evelyn herself. She was always one step ahead, as if she knew their moves before they even made them. And then, a breakthrough, a single frame of security footage. A woman stepping onto a train in Prague, a scarf wrapped around her face, her posture eerily familiar. The analyst froze the image, enhanced the pixels, ran facial recognition. 99.8% match. The ghost had surfaced, and Obsidian was ready. Evelyn had spent years avoiding mistakes, but even ghosts could be caught. It happened on a quiet street in Istanbul. She had trusted the wrong person, a contact she had believed was safe, a man who had once risked his life to help her. But the machine had reached him first. They had given him an impossible choice: hand over Evelyn or disappear into the abyss. And so, as she stepped through the narrow alleys of the old city, she felt it before she saw it. The silence, the way the air felt heavier, the way the streets were too empty. A trap. She turned to run, but it was already too late. Black SUVs screeched around the corners. Armed men flooded the alley. Evelyn moved fast, disappearing into the crowd, weaving through bodies. But they had been waiting too long for this moment. A gunshot, a sharp pain in her side. She staggered, the world spinning. A hand grabbed her arm. Not a soldier. Jameson, the man who had betrayed her once before. But this time, there was regret in his eyes. "This is the only way," he whispered. And then, darkness. When Evelyn awoke, she knew exactly where she was. A black site. One of the places the machine denied existed. No windows, no time, no outside world. She had prepared for this moment. She had known, deep down, that it would come. But knowing didn't make it easier. She sat in the cold metal chair, hands bound, as the door opened. A man stepped in. Suit, no insignia. The kind of man whose name would never appear in any official record. "You've been running a long time," he said, his voice smooth. "But it's over now." Evelyn stared at him, unmoved. "If it were over," she said, "you wouldn't be wasting time talking." The man smiled faintly. "You're right. We don't need you." He leaned closer. "We just need the world to believe you're gone." For weeks, the world heard nothing. No leaks, no messages, no whispers of Evelyn Mercer. Obsidian had buried her so deeply that even the unseen began to doubt. Had they finally won? Had the machine, after all these years, finally erased the woman who had defied them? Government celebrated in silence. The unseen grieved in secret. The world, they believed, would move on. And then, a new leak. A document so damning that no amount of suppression could contain it. Not just proof of Evelyn's capture, but a full confession, signed with her name, broadcast across the world. The machine had forced Evelyn Mercer to confess, to denounce the movement she had built, to admit that the leaks were lies, that she had been wrong, that she had been manipulated. It was the final step. They had erased Evelyn Mercer from history itself, or so they thought. The unseen didn't believe it. They knew Evelyn. They knew she would never confess, unless it wasn't a confession, unless it was something else. A message, hidden deep in the text of the broadcast, buried in the structure of the sentences, was a single phrase, "Still watching." And in that moment, the world understood. Evelyn hadn't given up. She had given them a signal, a call to arms. A final battle was coming, and the unseen were ready. Obsidian thought they had won. But in the days that followed, something happened that even they had not expected. The machine itself began to crack. The leaks didn't stop. They multiplied. Inside Obsidian, inside the very agencies hunting Evelyn, people began to question, to defect. The world saw what had been done to her, and they refused to forget. Evelyn Mercer was no longer a fugitive. She was a revolution. And as long as the machine existed, as long as corruption remained, her war would never be over. Because truth is not a person. It is not a name. It is an idea. And ideas never die. The woman who knew too much and the truth that would never die. They thought they had won. The world had seen the so-called confession, the staged surrender of Evelyn Mercer. Governments issued their quiet sighs of relief. Corporations continued their dealings, emboldened by the silence. The media, ever controlled, moved on to the next crisis, the next distraction. And yet, something was wrong. The world did not forget. The unseen did not stop. Evelyn's name had become more than a person, more than a myth. She had become a question, a whisper that refused to be silenced. If they went to such lengths to bury her, what else were they hiding? And in that question, something began to shift. Not just among the unseen, not just among activists and journalists, but in ordinary people, those who had once turned away from the truth, believing it was not their fight. For the first time, the world did not look away. For the first time, they began to see. Obsidian celebrated their victory in secret meetings. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. It started with small acts. A government insider who leaked classified documents, revealing the extent of surveillance on citizens. A financial executive who exposed the machine's darkest secret, how war and suffering were manufactured for profit. A journalist, once silenced, who now spoke louder than ever. And then, something unprecedented happened. A defection? Not a low-level informant. A high-ranking official, someone within Obsidian itself. He did not flee to another country. He did not go into hiding. He stepped in front of the cameras, in broad daylight, and spoke the words that changed everything. Evelyn Mercer told the truth. The world held its breath, and the machine staggered. People had always feared the machine. They believed it was too powerful to fight, too deeply entrenched to change. But now they saw the truth. The machine was not invincible. It was not all-knowing. It was not untouchable. It only had power as long as people accepted its lies. And they were no longer willing to accept them. Protests erupted not just in isolated cities, but everywhere. Leaders were forced to step down. Institutions collapsed. And the unseen, once a shadow movement, stepped into the light. The machine had controlled the world for too long. Now, the world was taking itself back. In a quiet town, far from the chaos, a woman sat by a window, watching the rain. Her hair was streaked with grey. Her face bore the lines of a life spent fighting battles most would never understand. She had no name here, no history. She had become no one. And yet, she had never been more alive. A soft knock on the door. She did not turn immediately. She simply smiled, because she already knew. The fight was over, not because the machine had been destroyed, not because corruption had disappeared, but because the world had changed, because people had opened their eyes. The truth could no longer be hidden, and that was all she had ever wanted. She stood, moving slowly, carefully, as if savoring the moment. Then, as she reached for the door, she whispered the words that had guided her all these years. The truth only wins when people are willing to see it. She opened the door and disappeared into history. Evelyn Mercer did not win because she was the strongest. She did not win because she had power. She won because she had conviction, because she refused to look away, because she believed in something greater than herself. The world is often controlled by those who believe power is permanent. But power is only permanent if people allow it to be. Truth is not about one person. It is not about one moment. It is about persistence, about courage, about choosing to see, even when it is easier to look away. The machine will always exist in some form, but so will those who fight against it. Because as long as there are people willing to seek the truth, then no lie will ever last forever.